Under the warm glow of a single table lamp, Maya Lawson sat in her favorite armchair, a book resting loosely in her lap, though her eyes had drifted away from the page long ago. The house she had moved into only 3 months earlier had the kind of quiet charm that people often searched for but rarely found. Thick brick walls, tall sash windows, and hardwood floors that creaked softly in a way that felt more alive than unsettling. It stood at the end of a narrow, tree-lined street in a historic part of town, the sort of neighborhood where people waved to each other in passing but rarely intruded, where life moved just slow enough for someone like her to finally breathe after. Years of rushing between obligations. This was supposed to be her place of renewal, a deliberate step toward stability after the turbulence of the last few years. She had chosen the house for its sense of permanence, the way it seemed rooted into the earth, its foundation unshakable, as though it had already endured decades of weather, owners, and secrets without losing its dignity. It wasn't perfect, no house of its age could be, but each imperfection felt personal and forgivable, a story left behind by the hands that had lived there before. That night was like many others since she had moved in. A cup of tea cooling on the side table, the distant hum of traffic from the main road softened by the thick walls, the occasional rustle of leaves outside. The air inside was still and faintly scented with the lemon polish she had used on the banister earlier in the day. Somewhere upstairs, an old radiator ticked as it released the last of its heat, the sound so familiar now that she hardly noticed it. She had been planning the next stages of her slow but careful renovation. Nothing drastic, just bringing back some of the original details she'd uncovered, like the decorative moldings hidden under layers of paint and the narrow built-in cupboards, tucked between rooms. She liked the idea of restoring rather than replacing, of working with the house rather than against it. Yet beneath the surface calm, there was a faint tension she couldn't quite name. Perhaps it was just the weight of the change she had made, moving into a neighborhood where she knew no one, in a building old enough to have its own quirks and silences. She had already learned that the structure sometimes groaned when the wind pressed hard against it, that pipes in the kitchen wall would thump quietly when the water heater clicked on. But as she sat there, absent-mindedly turning the page she had already read twice, something faint and unfamiliar reached her ears. A low vibration, almost like a far-off motor, steady and mechanical. At first she thought it might be coming from outside, maybe a neighbor's late-night home project, but then it deepened. A distinct metallic resonance that seemed to come from somewhere within the walls themselves. She straightened slightly, listening harder, and the vibration stopped, leaving only the sound of her own breathing. She waited for it to return, telling herself it was nothing, probably an appliance cycling off, yet a faint unease had crept into her chest. Subtle but persistent. This was her home, solid and safe, and she refused to let her imagination take that away from her. Still, a part of her knew she would remember that sound long after the silence had returned. It was well past 1 a.m. when Maya awoke again, this time not to a vague vibration but to a sharp, unmistakable mechanical whirring, followed by the grinding resistance of metal biting into something solid. At first she thought it was part of a dream clinging to her as she drifted awake, but then came the dull, rhythmic thud of a drill pushing forward, a pause, and another burst of spinning. Her eyes adjusted slowly to the darkness, the thin strip of moonlight slipping through the gap in the curtains just enough to outline the familiar shapes of her bedroom. She held her breath, waiting for the sound to stop, but instead it grew clearer, closer, and far too deliberate to be an accident. It wasn't in the distance. It wasn't even outside. It was inside the house. She pushed back the covers and placed her bare feet onto the cold floor, every muscle tensing as she tried to decide whether to grab her phone or simply listen longer to make sure she wasn't imagining things. The sound came again. Steady pressure, then release, then another bite of the drill. It was coming from the wall that separated her living room from the small front hall. Heart pounding harder now, she stepped carefully toward the bedroom door, each board in the old floor groaning faintly beneath her weight. She stopped halfway, straining to hear if it was just one person, but the murmur of low voices reached her. 2, maybe 3 people speaking in short bursts she couldn't make out. Her first instinct was to shout, to demand they stop, but common sense cut through the fog of adrenaline. Confronting people who had already entered her home uninvited in the dead of night could escalate into something she couldn't control. She turned quietly, reaching for the small flashlight she kept in her nightstand and her old digital camera that she had been using to document the renovations. She had no desire to fumble with the phone in case the noise drew attention, and she didn't want them to hear her calling anyone just yet. Moving silently down the hall, she crouched low near the corner where the living room opened up. The glow of a portable work light spilled across the floor, a harsh beam cutting against the warm tones of her old wooden panels. 2 men in reflective vests, each with a patch stitched over the left pocket bearing the name of the local housing association, were positioned near the far wall, one holding the drill while the other peered through a narrow hole already bored in 2. The plaster, a black case, sat open at their feet, lined with tools that looked more specialized than anything she had ever seen for pest control. The man with the drill pulled it back, switched bits, and leaned in again while his partner adjusted a device that resembled a small fiber optic camera. She stayed in the shadows, snapping a few quick photos without the flash, her hands steady despite the rush of adrenaline. She needed proof, something undeniable, because she already suspected that if she confronted them without it, they would have a story ready, polished and confident, the kind of explanation designed to make her look unreasonable. She stepped back slowly, planning her next move, but a floorboard betrayed her with a sharp creak. Both men turned their heads in unison, the one closest to the wall squinting into the dim hallway where she stood. "Ma'am?" the taller one called out, his tone entirely too casual for the situation. "Everything's fine. We're just conducting an emergency inspection for termites. It's standard procedure. We've had some urgent reports in this area." She kept her voice level, masking the disbelief boiling inside her. "At 1:30 in the morning? Without my consent? In my living room?" The shorter man, still holding the strange camera device, straightened and gestured vaguely toward the wall. "When there's structural risk, we're authorized to act immediately to prevent further damage. It's all covered under the association's jurisdiction. You should have received a notice." Her eyes flicked to the small pile of pale dust collecting on the floor beneath the hole they had made, the faint metallic gleam of something inside the cavity. "I haven't received anything," she said sharply, her tone tightening despite her effort to stay calm. "And you're going to stop now." The taller man tilted his head slightly, as if humoring her. "We'll just need another 5 minutes to finish this section and confirm the scope of the infestation. Otherwise, you could be looking at a much bigger problem down the line." Maya didn't move from her spot in the hall. "You're finished now. Leave." For a moment, the air thickened between them, the only sound the faint hum from their work light. Then, with an exaggerated sigh, the man with the drill withdrew it from the wall and began packing up, his partner closing the black case with a muted click. They moved slowly, deliberately, as though to show they were leaving on their terms, not hers. When they finally stepped out into the cold night, she locked the door behind them and stood in the silence. The beam from the work light now just a memory etched into the darkened living room. She walked over to the wall and crouched beside the hole. Inside, beyond the splintered plaster, she could see a sliver of something that didn't belong there, thin wiring and the edge of a metal casing, wedged neatly between the wooden studs. She didn't touch it yet, didn't remove it. Instead, she backed away slowly, her mind already moving ahead to the questions she would need to ask and the people she would need to involve. Whatever their reason for being in her home tonight, it had nothing to do with termites, and she knew better than to assume they wouldn't be back. By the time the morning light reached the edges of her curtains, Maya had slept no more than an hour, her mind turning over every detail of what she had seen, from the metallic casing in her wall to the measured way the 2 men had spoken, as if they had rehearsed the lines a dozen times before. She sat at her kitchen table nursing a mug of coffee gone lukewarm. The photographs she had taken the night before open on her camera's small screen. They were grainy and poorly lit, but the shapes were clear enough. The reflective vests, the drill bit glinting under the work light, the unfamiliar case on the floor. She uploaded them to her laptop, enlarging the images until the names on the patches became almost legible. She made a note of them, not trusting herself to remember once the day began to erode her focus. Before she could decide on her next step, a sharp knock came at the front door. She glanced at the clock, barely past 8, and the tension in her shoulders tightened. Opening the door just enough to see outside, she found a man in a dark jacket holding an envelope, his expression neutral, almost bored. Without a word, he handed it to her and walked back toward a waiting sedan, the engine already running. She closed the door and slid a finger under the flap. Inside was a single sheet of paper, printed in formal language and headed with the seal of the neighborhood association. It stated, in clipped, impersonal terms, that she was being cited for obstructing an authorized emergency inspection, a violation that could carry both fines and further corrective measures if repeated. Her hands tightened around the paper. There was no acknowledgement of the hour they had entered, no mention of her lack of consent, only the cold assertion that she had interfered. She set the notice down on the counter, fighting the urge to tear it in half. Instead, she picked up her phone and called the one person she trusted to see through the layers of pretense. Daniel Foster, an attorney who had been a friend of her late husband and had handled some of their affairs years ago. His voice on the other end was calm, almost weary, but when she told him about the night's events, the tone sharpened. "Do not touch that wall again," he instructed firmly. "Do not remove anything. Document it as it is. I'll arrange for a licensed inspector to come in, someone independent, and will also notify the police about the unlawful entry. But you do not engage with them directly again." She promised she wouldn't, though her instincts itched to pry into the hole herself. Daniel reminded her to keep all correspondence, physical or electronic, and to write down everything she remembered, no matter how small it seemed. By late morning, the inspector Daniel had called, a quiet, methodical man named Harris, arrived with a heavy toolkit and an air of measured patience. He examined the hole carefully, using a small mirror and flashlight to peer inside before taking a series of photographs. Then he set up a portable scope to get a closer look without disturbing anything. When he finally straightened, his brow was furrowed. "This is not pest control work," he said plainly. "That casing looks like a concealed electronics module, possibly for surveillance. The wiring doesn't match your electrical system. It's a separate line, and it's been secured in a way that suggests it's meant to stay hidden." She felt the air in her lungs tighten. "Surveillance? In my living room?" Harris nodded, jotting notes on a clipboard. "I can't tell if it's active without opening the wall, but it's not something you'd find in a normal inspection. Whoever put this in knew what they were doing." "It's clean work." He packed his tools but left her with a written preliminary report and his business card, advising her to keep the area untouched until law enforcement could take a look. When he was gone, the house felt heavier, as if the walls themselves were listening. Maya sat on the edge of the couch glancing at the notice from the association still lying on the counter. The language had seemed threatening before. Now it felt like an outright warning. Her phone buzzed, an unfamiliar number, and against her better judgment, she answered. The voice on the other end was a woman's, smooth and clipped, identifying herself as the association's property compliance officer. She spoke as if last night's events had been entirely routine, insisting that the inspection had been triggered by an urgent tip from another resident about possible structural infestation in Maya's home. When Maya pressed for details, who had reported it, why it had to be done in the middle of the night, the voice cooled further, falling back on vague references to policy and community safety standards. Before hanging up, the woman added, almost as an afterthought, "We trust you'll be more cooperative in the future, Mrs. Lawson." These matters are always easier when we work together." Maya set the phone down, the words sticking like burrs in her mind. It was a warning, wrapped in civility. She knew now that whatever this was, it went far beyond termites, and they had no intention of letting her refusal end it. She walked back to the living room, staring at the small, perfect circle cut into her wall, the pale dust still scattered on the floor. The night before, it had felt like a violation. Now it felt like the opening move in a game she had no intention of losing. 2 days later, Maya found herself sitting in Daniel Foster's downtown office, the heavy curtains drawn against the midday sun, and the faint hum of city traffic muffled by the thick walls. The preliminary report from Harris lay on the polished oak desk between them, its language clinical but damning. Daniel read through the pages again with the same deliberate care he had given it earlier, occasionally pausing to circle a phrase or underline a date. Across from him, Maya kept her hands clasped in her lap, trying to quiet the restless energy in her legs. She had gone over the events so many times that the timeline was etched into her memory. Yet each time she recounted it, she found herself adding small details she had almost forgotten. The exact angle of the work light, the way one of the men had glanced toward the door as if checking for someone else, the faint scent of machine oil clinging to the air long after they had left. Daniel looked up at her finally, his expression grave. "This isn't just about your house," he said. "The device Harris described, it's not standard issue for any municipal inspection. It's specialized equipment, likely expensive, and whoever installed it did so without leaving obvious external marks. That means planning, access, and intent. The question is why?" She asked him the same question she had been asking herself in quieter moments. Why her? Why this house? Daniel leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. "Sometimes it's not about the person as much as the property. Old houses like yours have histories, previous owners, stored items, even architectural features that can be exploited. I've seen cases where certain properties were targeted because they offered access to neighboring structures or to utilities. But Harris's description makes me think this is more focused. Someone wanted to see or hear what happens inside your walls." The thought unsettled her more than she wanted to admit, but she kept her voice steady. "What do we do next?" Daniel outlined the steps with calm precision. File a formal police report, deliver Harris's documentation, and request that a forensic technician examine the device before it was removed. Simultaneously, he would send a letter to the association demanding all records related to the so-called inspection, including work orders, authorizations, and the names of personnel involved. "They'll resist," he warned, "and they might double down on the narrative that you were uncooperative. But this puts them on notice. They'll know you're not handling it alone." That afternoon, she followed him to the police station, where an officer in a pressed Navy uniform listened patiently as she described the night's events. The photographs and Harris's report were added to the case file, and arrangements were made for a technician to visit her home within 48 hours. As they left, Daniel murmured, "Now we see how quickly they react." The reaction came sooner than either of them expected. That evening, Maya returned from running errands to find a folded flyer shoved under her door. In large, blocky letters, it announced a special community safety meeting, scheduled for the following week, with attendance strongly encouraged for all residents. At the bottom, her address was singled out as one of several properties of concern. No explanation was offered, only a vague reference to structural and environmental hazards. She read it twice, a slow burn of anger building in her chest. This was no invitation. It was a public mark, a way to frame her as a problem in the eyes of her neighbors before the truth could surface. She could already imagine the whispers, the sidelong glances, the quiet distancing from those who preferred to avoid conflict. The next morning, she woke to the sound of a truck idling outside her window. Peering through the curtains, she saw 2 men in work overalls unloading equipment onto the sidewalk. Ladders, tarps, a box of tools. When she stepped outside to ask what they were doing, one of them handed her a clipboard with a work order claiming urgent exterior assessment approved by the association. Her refusal was met with a flat, rehearsed line. "Ma'am, we're authorized to proceed. This will only take a couple of hours." She stood her ground, insisting they leave until she could confirm the order's legitimacy. They didn't argue, but neither did they hurry to pack up. Instead, they made a show of moving slowly, talking just loudly enough for her to hear fragments, words like non-compliant and risk report, before finally loading their truck and driving. Away. Inside, her phone buzzed with a message from Daniel. "Just heard from a contact. Your situation's on their internal agenda. They're discussing remediation measures. Stay alert." That night, she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The idea had taken root in her mind after Harris's inspection, but now it felt tangible. The creaks and sighs of the old house no longer blended into the background. They pricked at her attention, each one a possible sign of intrusion. She moved through the rooms with deliberate care, checking windows, locks, and even the small attic hatch she rarely touched. Near midnight, as she passed the front hall, a faint metallic click sounded from somewhere within the wall near the original drill hole. She froze, listening, but it didn't repeat. Whether it was mechanical or just her imagination no longer mattered. The unease it left behind was real enough. The following day, the forensic technician arrived, a woman named Evelyn with a compact kit and a practiced manner. She examined the hole in silence for several minutes before extracting a slim, sealed unit, no larger than a paperback, from inside the wall. She slipped it into an evidence bag without comment, but when Maya asked what it was, Evelyn's tone was careful. "I can't give you specifics until the lab looks at it, but this isn't pest control. You did the right thing by not touching it." When Evelyn left, Maya called Daniel immediately, relaying the discovery. He was quiet for a moment, then said, "This changes the leverage. If that device is what I think it is, they're in far deeper trouble than they realize." As she ended the call, Maya stood in the middle of her living room, the late afternoon light slanting across the floor. The hole in the wall was now empty, but the space it left behind felt like more than just damaged plaster. It was a reminder that the safety she had taken for granted had been breached in a way that was both calculated and invasive. She understood now that the real battle wasn't just about proving they had entered unlawfully, it was about uncovering the reason they had done it in the first place. And that reason, she suspected, would be something they would fight to keep hidden at any cost. The results from the lab came back faster than Maya expected, though Daniel had warned her that speed was not necessarily a good sign. When his number appeared on her phone late in the afternoon, she answered before the first ring had finished, pacing the length of her living room as he spoke. The device pulled from her wall was, in plain terms, an active audio transmitter, one designed for long-term operation, with its own concealed power source and wireless output. It wasn't the kind of thing a casual intruder could buy at a hardware store, nor the sort of equipment used in any legitimate building inspection. It was professional-grade surveillance, discreet enough that it might have gone unnoticed for months, perhaps even years, if she hadn't happened to be awake that night. Daniel's voice stayed even, but she could hear the undercurrent of urgency. "The police are officially treating this as a criminal matter, but you need to understand. This will make them desperate. The more exposed they feel, the more they'll push back. I want you to be careful with where you go, who you speak to, and what you say, even inside your own home until we know exactly how many of these devices there are." The warning felt heavy, and Maya found herself looking instinctively toward the other walls, wondering where else they might have hidden something. That evening, she decided to stay with a friend across town, thinking it would give her some distance while Daniel worked the legal angles. But when she returned 2 days later, the first thing she noticed was the faint smell of fresh paint in the hallway, sharp and chemical, though she had not left any work scheduled. Her heart dropped as she saw that a section of wall near the back door had been patched and painted over, the color slightly mismatched in the afternoon light. She checked the locks, unchanged, and then the windows, all of which were closed, but the unease was immediate and suffocating. Whoever had been there had done so quietly, methodically, and without breaking anything visible. She took photos of the wall, then called Daniel, who urged her to document everything and contact the police immediately. An officer arrived within the hour, inspected the area, and confirmed that the patch was recent. He made notes for the report but offered no guarantee they would find whoever was responsible. "If they've got a key, there's no sign of forced entry," he said, almost apologetically. "That makes it harder." His tone suggested he knew more than he was saying, but Maya didn't press. She could feel herself being drawn toward the edge of frustration, and she knew they would use any sign of aggression against her. Later that night, just as she was beginning to settle into the idea of a quiet evening, the doorbell rang. On her porch stood a man she recognized from the association's board meetings. Tall, sharp-featured, with a smile that seemed more rehearsed than warm. He held a slim folder under one arm and wasted no time in stating his business. "We've received reports of continuing safety concerns at your property," he began, his tone balanced somewhere between polite concern and quiet authority. "Frankly, some of your neighbors are worried. If you're willing to authorize us to conduct a more thorough inspection, during the day, of course, we can put these issues to rest and close the file." Maya kept her hand on the door, ready to shut it. "The last inspection you authorized was in my living room at 2 a.m. I think we're done with that." His expression flickered just for a moment before settling back into the practiced smile. That was an unusual circumstance. "But if you don't let us resolve this, we may have to consider other remedies. Fines, formal hearings, possibly even action regarding property compliance. I'd hate to see it come to that." She said nothing, only stepped back and closed the door. For the next hour she moved through the house in a quiet storm of thought, trying to balance the urge to fight openly with the need to follow Daniel's advice. But when she went into the kitchen, she found an envelope pushed under the back door, its flap unsealed. Inside was a single sheet with a printed notice. She was being scheduled for a compliance hearing the following month to address repeated obstruction of mandated safety protocols. The phrasing was deliberately vague, but the implication was clear. They were building a formal case against her. Over the next week, small disruptions began to accumulate. A contractor arrived without appointment, claiming he had been told to replace a section of fencing along her property line. Her trash collection was skipped twice in a row, despite her calls to the sanitation department. The water pressure in her kitchen sink dropped inexplicably for 2 days before returning to normal. Each incident on its own was inconvenient but minor. Together, they formed a pattern, a slow tightening of pressure meant to force her into compliance or exhaustion. Daniel worked to counter each move, filing notices, pushing back on the hearing, and forwarding copies of Harris's report to the police and the city inspector's office. But Maya could feel the toll mounting, not just in her schedule, but in the way she found herself pausing before unlocking her own front door, listening for the smallest sign that something was wrong inside. One evening, while sorting through a pile of mail at the dining table, she found an envelope without a return address. Inside was a single photograph, grainy, taken from a low angle in her own living room. It showed her sitting on the couch, reading, completely unaware. The photo had been printed on plain paper, no message attached, as if to remind her that someone had been there, unseen, and could be there again whenever they chose. She stared at it for a long moment before sliding it into a folder with the other evidence. She would not give them the satisfaction of panic, but she also knew there was no turning back to the quiet, safe life she had imagined when she moved into this house. Whatever was happening had entered a new phase, and she would need every ounce of resolve to face what was coming next. The day of the compliance hearing arrived under a sky the color of dull steel, the air heavy with the scent of rain that had yet to fall. Maya dressed with care, choosing a dark, understated suit and tying her hair back, not to impress but to project control, Daniel met her outside the low, flat municipal building where the proceedings would be held, his briefcase in one hand, the other offering a steadying touch on her shoulder. "They'll try to rattle you," he murmured as they walked inside. "Stay with the facts. Let me handle the rest." The hearing room was smaller than she expected, almost claustrophobic, with a long table at the front where 3 members of the board sat, papers neatly stacked before them. The same sharp-featured man who had stood on her porch was there, now in a tailored suit, sitting at one end of the table with an air of quiet satisfaction. To his right, a woman in a gray blazer shuffled through a folder, her eyes flicking toward Maya with a look that was neither friendly nor neutral. The proceedings began with a recitation of the alleged violations: failure to comply with emergency safety protocols, obstruction of inspection, and conduct detrimental to community welfare. The language was broad enough to encompass almost anything which Daniel had warned her was deliberate. They wanted room to maneuver. When it was their turn to respond, Daniel rose and began methodically dismantling the accusations, producing Harris's report, the photographs from that night, and the police documentation of the device. He read from the lab's findings, letting the words hang in the air. Covert audio surveillance equipment installed without consent. A ripple of discomfort passed through the room, quickly masked by the neutral expressions of the board. The man in the tailored suit leaned forward, his voice smooth as he tried to dismiss the matter as a misunderstanding, caused by an overzealous contractor. But Daniel was ready, sliding a printed email across the table. An internal message obtained through a public records request, in which the same man authorized the special entry into Maya's home and referred to locating the target installation. Point for the device. The woman in the gray blazer glanced at the email, then at him, her expression tightening. What happened next shifted the room. A police officer, summoned by Daniel as a witness, stepped forward to confirm that the email and the device were now part of an active criminal investigation. The officer's presence carried weight, and for the first time, Maya saw a flicker of unease in the man's practiced composure. The board recessed for 10 minutes, retreating to a side room while the rest of the attendees sat in tense silence. Maya kept her eyes on the table, her heartbeat steady but fast, aware that this was the closest she had come to forcing them into a corner. When the board returned, their tone had changed. The chairwoman announced that the compliance hearing was being suspended indefinitely pending the outcome of the investigation, and that no further action would be taken against Maya until all matters were resolved. It wasn't a full victory, not yet, but it was a crack in the wall they had built around themselves. Outside, the rain had begun to fall, soft and steady, as Maya and Daniel walked to their cars. He told her quietly that the investigation would likely widen now, pulling in more names, uncovering more than just her case, but she also knew it meant the pressure on her might intensify in ways she couldn't predict. Still, as she slid into the driver's seat and closed the door against the rain, she felt something she hadn't in weeks, a sense that the tide, however slightly, had begun to turn in her favor. Weeks later, the investigation reached a point where the news could no longer be contained within the walls of meetings and quiet exchanges between attorneys. The police executed search warrants on several properties connected to the board members, uncovering not only additional surveillance devices identical to the one found in Maya's home, but also detailed records of targeted addresses, dates of entry, and instructions for concealing the work. The findings tied the operation to a private contractor with a history of working for undisclosed clients, and while the full scope of their motives remained under investigation, the pattern was undeniable. Maya's name was cleared formally in writing, the hearing against her dismissed permanently, and the association's leadership dissolved by an emergency vote of the remaining residents. The man who had stood so confidently at her porch was arrested on charges of unlawful surveillance and conspiracy, along with 2 others who had signed off on the entries. Maya did not celebrate loudly. The relief came in quieter ways. The absence of late-night knocks, the steady rhythm of her days returning, The simple act of locking her door without wondering if someone already had a key. She replaced the patched section of wall with new plaster, not to erase what had happened but to reclaim the space as her own, and installed additional security that blended seamlessly with the house's historic charm. Neighbors who had once kept their distance began stopping by with small words of support, a pie left on her porch, an offer to help with repairs. She accepted the kindness without dwelling on who had doubted her before, understanding that fear made people cautious in ways truth could not always cure. On a cool morning in early spring, she sat by the window with her tea, watching the street below come slowly alive. The house felt different now, still old, still creaking in the wind, but no longer heavy with the sense of being watched. It belonged to her again, and in that quiet, unremarkable moment, she realized that was victory enough.